So we made a big deal about the split of Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity, and we've seen the factors involving that, including language and geography, political changes, all kinds of stuff that's gone on to affect that split. At this point in time is really the kind of time where we're going to start pursuing more the Western tradition, going through the Pope, what becomes the Pope, the papacy in Rome, and into Protestantism, and so on. But before we did that, we did want to take one more glance at Eastern Christianity. One of the benefits of history, of course, is we can take 500 years of history and put it into one paragraph, right? It makes it a lot easier to be able to summarize what's happening. So we could see the schism happening for a long time. If you were living in it, however, it's not as obvious what's happening, right? You can't always see what the fruit of it's going to be. So as these people lived in it, they didn't see it as a split. They just saw it as they're a little bit different out east, right? Kind of like we view a lot of things, right? But we basically don't necessarily see a big difference. We just see, they're just different, right? Not a schism, but a difference. And what we find out from history is that little difference just becomes a gulf. But at this time, all they saw was, we speak Latin, you speak Greek, but we're all one church, right? That was the way they viewed things. So what happened at this point in the Eastern Church is still applicable to the West, still has influence. We'll talk about the Filioque here at the end, and that will be the thing that really drives. Now the West is really going to pursue their own route, and the East is really going to pursue their own route. And to be honest with you, they don't really interact for about 1,000 years. They actually don't like each other. And it isn't until the 20th century that the Pope and the Patriarch actually did try to reconcile across some ecumenical councils and so on. So when we say they split, it's actually pretty true. They split. And you're going to find out that it's not a really good reason why they split. But it is what it is. All right. So at the time, we're about in the middle of the first millennium. So we're in the 400, 500, 600, 700 era at this time. Okay? The Christological debate. We're going to go talk about the theology behind it first, and then we're going to talk about the personalities. Because history, what have we found out about history so far in the church? Does it revolve around our theological positions, our biblical interpretations? What does it generally revolve around so far? People, personalities, how you reacted, how you interacted, what you ignored and what you didn't ignore. So those are the things that we want to focus on as we go through, because that will really tell us a lot about where the church is. So Christological debate. We've talked about Arianism. What was Arianism? What was the big debate with Arianism?
Christ was created.
Christ was created. And so what was that calling into question? Whether he was really God. And earlier we talked about Docetism. What was Docetism? I had to go look this one up too because I can't remember all the isms. Docetism, I think it's where we get docent, but I'm not sure how that relates. Docetism was the idea that Jesus wasn't human. He was a spirit who had appearance as a man, but he wasn't really a man. And that arose from Gnosticism, which said that matter is evil, so therefore Jesus is good, so therefore Jesus can't have flesh because that would be bad. And so that was another place where our culture was impacting our theology. So that was Docetism. Now, both of those, so that means that we've had heresies that Jesus is not human, and heresies that Jesus is only human. And he's not divine, or at least not completely divine. Right? So we already talked about the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople, where that was rejected. And they came up with the phrase, right? He's very God of very God. He's man. There's 1,000 terms that they used for that. So what do you think the debate turns to now? Everybody's finally convinced that the Trinity is a Trinity. They're all 100% God. 3 substances, 3 persons, 1 substance. What else are we talking about now? What else could we possibly debate?
Holy Spirit.
No, that's already been settled. 3 persons, 1 substance. we still have this little debate about Jesus. Because what's wrong with Jesus?
Is this the modalism?
Modalism is a little different, but it's not effective yet. We'll come back to that. You'll find that one of the other heresies that happened right after the church started was called adoptionism. Adoptionism is the idea that Jesus was actually a man, born of Mary, walking around as a man, and then all of a sudden God decided to pluck him up and make him divine. He adopted him, right? That was around the rejected in the 300, 400 time frame. Guess what comes back up in the 800s? Spanish adoptionism. It's a cycle, right? The same stuff keeps coming up. All right, so we have one other issue that we don't need to understand, and so therefore we have to understand it, and that is, how can Jesus be 100% man and 100% God at the same time? We are explaining the Trinity, so now we need to explain the dual nature of Christ. Tertullian's already said it's two natures, one person. And the terms he used, unfortunately, were the same terms that were used for the Trinity. Specifically the word hypostases and the word oesia, or whatever. That means there's multiple hypostases and one oesia. So oesia was defined as the general thing. It's what made its essence. So when we say three persons in one substance is the oesia. That's God, that's divine. And then hypostases was the specific thing. So you could say there's oesia would be the fruit, and the hypostases is an apple or a banana or whatever else. Does that make sense? It's the general to the specific. So they want to take the same terms then and apply it to Jesus. He's one person, oesia is Jesus, and he has two hypostases, God and man. Okay? That's where we get the term hypostatic union, if you've ever heard of that. That's what that means. So the question was, how do you explain that? Because, of course, we have to explain that. The Bible's not allowed to have any mysteries. We have to explain everything, right? So the first guy to try this was a guy named Apollinaris. I'm sure it's probably Apollinaris. Apollinaris said, here's the deal. Jesus had a body, and he was a man, and then the divine came, and the human nature gave way to the divine. So the divine nature just kind of took over. So it was basically the divine nature in a human body. Well, that sounds okay. What's wrong with that? Because remember, Jesus was omniscient at times. It seemed like he was omnipresent at times. It seemed like he was omnipotent at times. And then there's other times where he wasn't. So how do we explain this? So his thought was, it had a human body. That explains the bleeding on the cross. But it was a divine nature that took over within that body, which explains his omnipotence and his all-knowledge, omniscience. Yeah.
Is he trying to claim that only one nature is active at a time? Or?
Is that what he's... Well, is he?
Sounds like they're in conflict. I mean, that sounds like that would be a bad thing.
Why would it be in conflict?
Because he took over.
Or it gave way. Right? What's the problem with that theory?
How in the world can Jesus die for the sins of all mankind if he's not fully human? Because the divine, he's got a human nature.
What makes a person? Right? Yeah. People say, well, wait a second. Either he is a person, a man, with his own soul, with his own being, or he's not. He can't have one without the other. Either Jesus is fully man, to be man and die for us, and he has to be fully God to be able to take the wrath of God. So they kind of started playing these things aside and saying, Apollinaris, your idea is horrid. It doesn't make any sense. This is what Gregory of Nazianzus said. If any believe in Jesus as a human being without human reason, without a soul, they are the ones devoid of all reason and unworthy of salvation. Kind of got to throw that one in there. For that which he has not taken up, he is not saved. He saved that which he joined to his divinity. If only half of Adam had fallen, then it would be possible for Christ to take up and save only half. But if the entire human nature fell, all of it must be united to the Word in order to be saved as a whole. Okay? So when this guy was around the Council of Constantinople. So when Constantinople made statements like that Jesus was being of one substance of the Father as well as made man, they were actually not only rejecting Arianism, they were actually rejecting Apollinaris' explanation of his dual nature. Okay? It was kind of a byline. Arianism was the main target, but explanations like this were also targeted. He's 100% man and 100% God. Now Tertullian was satisfied to say, that's all we need to know. Let's just leave it at that. But we couldn't leave it at that. We have to keep going, right? You're not allowed to stop there. Over time, two schools of thought arose. Okay, one is they were called the Alexandrian and the Antiochian. One's from Alexandria, the other's from Antioch. The two schools of thought developed over many years. Here's generalizations of what they thought on this topic. Okay, the Alexandrian position were generally allegorical. They focused on the divine kind of stuff. So what they had a tendency is to think more about how Jesus was more like God. They talked about salvation, how men were united to God and how he was redeeming us back to himself. And so they tended to take that kind of I'm going to heaven kind of view, not by itself, but kind of as a tendency. That's how I look at the world. I see that thing. That's what dominates my thinking. So they didn't necessarily deny the humanity of Christ, but they focused more on his deity, if that makes sense. Okay. The Antiochian were more literal interpretations, so they would have more in common with us. They saw salvation as God addressing the weaknesses of men and sin, and reconciliation on the basis of the penalty that we have to pay. They tended toward the factual and the concrete. So when they read their Bibles, what did they see? Well, they saw Jesus walking amongst men, teaching, doing miracles, and so on. It's not that they deny the deity of Christ, but they focused on his humanity because that was concrete. They could read about that. They didn't try to go through the text and try to guess at what he really was. Does that make sense, how those two positions work? Okay, so as it comes to this, one side focused on his deity, the other side focused on his humanity. Okay, that's the generalizations. And of course I went out of order, so now I'm lost. Okay. So what happens is the Alexandrian school, they end up focusing more on how the two natures could be unified, right? While the Antiochian school focuses more... Sorry, I stepped on the cord. The camera moved. All right, sorry. I'll just teach the rest of it like this. The Alexandrian school tend to focus more on how they unified, and they would keep going off on that end of the spectrum. And then the Antiochians would focus on how there was two natures, because that was literal, right? Sometimes he was described as human, sometimes he was described as deity. If you look at the Bible, that's exactly what happens. There are times where he's described as a suffering servant, and we're described as the one sent of God and the Messiah, and he had passed through whole crowds of people. He had omniscience, knowing what was happening to, I think it was Andrew, when he called the disciples, and John. So there's these these godlike properties, and then he died on a cross, and he bled, and he wept, and he did all these things that are very human. So we see both descriptions in the Bible. So they said, well, that's what I can read, so that must be true. And so what was they? Well, they would go on that side of the spectrum where the dual natures became the dominant factor, and they started losing the unity, the hypostatic union. They started losing that. Okay? That's the theology. Now, if you're wondering, does that seem like a big deal? It's not that big a deal. It is a big deal, and it's not. Where it was debated, Antioch and Alexandria. Where are those two cities? Turkey and Greece, roughly. Egypt. Alexandria's in Egypt. Good point. Fine. Alexandria's in Egypt. But if you were to look at a map of Europe, including the northern part of Egypt and Turkey, where would you put those cities? East or west? So where were these debates raging? In the east. What was happening in the west? What was the debate in the west?
Where the nice cave is to hide from the next barbarian
Yeah.
invasion.
Who's coming next? We just got rid of the Vandals. Oh, here comes Attila the Hun. All right. What's happening with the hypostatic union? I don't really know. We need to figure out how we're going to feed our people in the next siege. So let's just go ahead and, because now all our fields have been burned because the Vandals wanted to destroy this before the Greeks came and helped them. So now we don't have any food now that the Vandals are gone. Hey, Greece, no, we're too busy fighting the Persians. So what was happening in the West? Well, they were fending for themselves. They didn't have time for deep theological discussion. But in the East, these two cities in particular were very insulated. And so they got to debate things like this. And you're not going to be impressed with the debate. I'm just going to tell you right now. All right, Council of Ephesus. We talked about Apollinaris. Apollinaris. He was rejected, right? The next guy to rise was a guy named Nestorius. He was bishop of Constantinople in 428. He was from the Antiochian school, so his tendency was towards separating the two natures. And he decided he wanted to change something that the church had used for centuries. They called Mary Theotokos. Okay, that means the bearer of God, the one who brought forth God. Okay, now before you react, what was the emphasis at the time? Why wouldn't we like that term in our time? The Theotokos, the bearer of God.
This seems to put her above Jesus.
Because it makes her sound like she's holding God, right? Well, at the time, the emphasis was on what? What was the first challenge that the church had to deal with in regard to Jesus? Well, he was fully God, right? So when they say Theotokos, what they're saying is, no, he was God since his birth. He was 100% born, and he was 100% God when he was born. So Mary was the bearer of God. They wanted to emphasize the fact that Jesus was God from the very beginning, right? So the term is not about Mary. The term is actually about Jesus. Does that make sense? Well, by now, the issue is, but we don't want to just say that he's just God. So Nestorius said, how about if we change the term to Christotokos, the bearer of Christ? That way we take the implication that it's just God away and we just say that he's Christ. Well, what's the first thing he did? What's his first problem? Trying to change tradition, especially one that's a few hundred years old, yeah, it's not going to happen. Okay? So he tries to do this. That gives him all kinds of attention. Then he starts describing how Jesus is actually two persons, two natures in two persons. They're actually two separate people inside Jesus that just agree to work together. Okay? In other words, remember I said that you get to the end of the spectrum and you start going off the deep end. And he started taking the hypostatic union and making it sound more like a peace treaty. That there was two separate natures that had separate individual wills and thoughts, and they were just agreeing to work together in this one person named Jesus. Okay? And that's going too far to that side. It's a mystery that can't be explained, and he tried to explain it. Okay? So the two natures and two persons was not really something popular. And so people said, that's not good theology, Nestorius. We need to take you to task. Right? Because that's what we've seen throughout church history of what causes councils. Is people that have bad theology and we just want to correct them and bring them back to the fold. True? Okay, so what's probably going to happen? Now the guy's got errant theology, so that opens the door to what? Attack him. So here's the issue. In the Council of Constantinople, we talked about the Arian aspect. There was one little canon in there, that canon being like one decision, that decided to grant Constantinople, the Bishop of Constantinople, was now issued to be second in charge of the church behind Rome. Okay? Even though it was new at the time. That's what's key to remember. Constantinople was established by Constantine. Remember, he just picked up and moved everything over? So they said, well, since that's the capital, that guy must be important. Very biblical, wouldn't you say? So they just decided to say the Bishop of Constantinople is second behind the Bishop of Rome. They said the old Rome and the new Rome. This is the old Rome, this is the new Rome. Well, Antioch had been around forever, Alexandria had been around forever, and they were both kind of shut out and said, well, you guys are just, yeah, you're great. But all we care about is Rome and Constantinople. Well, if you put it on a map, what you see is both of those guys are pretty close to Constantinople, so they started getting into a competition of, can Antioch own the bishop, or does Alexandria supply the bishop? And so they just keep going back and forth. Well, Nestorius was an Antiochian, and he had errant theology. So what does this open the door to? Alexandria. Hey, Alexandria, we can go get this guy and get back our bishop in Constantinople. And why did having the Bishop of Constantinople matter? Because he was second in charge behind Rome. And who else was in Constantinople? The emperor. So who gets the ear of the emperor? The Bishop of Constantinople. So how do we make sure that our policies and our theology get spread around the church? By getting that guy's ear. It's depressing, isn't it? So they decided to call a council.
What was going on with the church or any church in Israel at this time?
They were still part, at this point, they were still owned by the Byzantine Empire. And so there was actually a bishop of Jerusalem who held some amount of power. But they're not significant. And in about 200 years, they're going to be taken over by the Muslims. And then the church is wiped out. Did that answer your question? Yep. All right, so Cyril is the bishop of Alexandria. He decides to call a council in Ephesus, or he convinces the emperor to call a council in Ephesus. To hear about Nestorius. Okay? So as they're waiting, Nestorius' chief supporters are delayed, leaving Nestorius to defend himself, which he doesn't do very well. Cyril went ahead with the council without the Nestorian supporters. Nestorius was not allowed to defend himself, and eventually he's declared a heretic by the Alexandrian guys that were running the council to begin with, without any kind of defense. Well, that seems totally fair. So then Nestorius' supporters, led by a guy named John of Antioch, show up. They find out that the council's already heard and decided all the decisions, so what do? Call their own council, right? And what was their decision? That Nestorius was actually okay, and it's actually Cyril who's a heretic. So basically now we have that whole school cheering thing. We got spirit, yes we do. And the other side has to respond back. So now we've got rival councils in Ephesus just pointing the finger and saying, no, you're the heretic. Oh yeah, well you're the heretic, right? And that's all they're doing. They're going back and forth. Finally, the emperor, Theodosius II, intervenes, arrests both Cyril and John, and says both of your councils are null. Forget it. Okay. Over time, they're both released. Theodosius negotiates what he calls a formula of union, and Nestorius, though, is upheld as a heretic, and he's abandoned. He's exiled, and then he's such an embarrassment to the Antiochians that they actually continue to reject him. He keeps having to move further and further to the corners of the empire. It's actually kind of sad. Interestingly, because we won't have time to go over this, followers of Nestorius also leave the empire, okay? And they go east into Persia, into what we would call Iran. They set up a church there that lasts for centuries. In fact, they were so effective, they had missionaries going into all parts of Asia as far as China. India, China, they were scattered throughout Central Asia. And they lasted for a few hundred years until the Muslims came, then they were kind of wiped out. But these guys are actually pretty effective as a church in their missionary aspects. All right, so we now have a truce between the Alexandrian and the Antiochians, but that doesn't last. Cyril dies, and he's succeeded by a guy named Dioscorus. This guy's a slime ball. He had a very extreme Alexandrian position. So we talked about Nestorius taking this extreme position of saying two persons, two natures, just two battling people that agree to get along. Dioscorus took the opposite and said, no, there's one. There's actually one nature, and it's a singular. They're so intertwined that they become one thing. And where this comes into play is a guy named Eutyches. Eutyches he took the position that the two natures were so combined that they actually fuse into a whole nother unit. Does that make sense? So what's the problem with that approach? It's the same problem we had before.
Makes him something different.
He's no longer human or divine. He's unique. Well, remember, he can't die for what you're not. And so if he's not human, he can't die for us either. So this all starts to battle against core Christian beliefs. So Eutyches then is accused by a guy named Eusebius, another Eusebius, and he's thrown out. That appeals to Flavian. Flavian is the Antiochian bishop of Constantinople who declares Eutyches a heretic. We feel like we have a history repeating itself. So here's Dioscorus, who's the bishop of Alexandria, wanting the position in Constantinople, and now having an excuse to go after Flavian, the bishop of Constantinople. All right, so let's see how this one plays out. So Eutyches is declared a heretic. Dioscorus works through the emperor. There were significant amounts of gold all of a sudden going from Alexandria to Constantinople about this time, go figure. And there's also a council that was called. And guess who gets to preside over this council? Dioscorus. And guess what the president of the council gets to do? Decide who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. Now, the Bishop of Rome is watching all this. We said that they're not just checked out yet. And so they actually send a letter by a guy named Hilary. Hilary ends up becoming a pope later on. But they send a letter saying, here's my thoughts on this matter of the dual natures. Okay? So he sends a letter. Dioscorus knows that the Bishop of Rome doesn't agree with him. So what does he do? What do you think he does?
Ignores it.
Doesn't allow him to speak. On the other hand, who does he allow to speak? Eutyches. And what does Eutyches say? It's all a big misunderstanding. Flavians, that's not what I said. I said that there was two natures in one person. I'm 100% Orthodox and 100% Nicene. It was just a big misunderstanding. I don't get it. Right? Dioscorus says, oh, that's perfect. I knew it. Well, Flavian, do you have anything to say for yourself? Oh, too late. Let's move on. So guess what happens? Flavian's not allowed to defend himself. Eusebius is not allowed to defend himself. All they hear is a testimony of Eutyches. And so what's the sentence? Well, Flavian, you declared Eutyches a heretic unfairly, so an eye for an eye means that we should do, what do you, Flavian? Declare you a heretic. And so an angry mob comes in, and they beat the guy until he's this close to death on the altar. They take him away, and he dies a day later. Well, that's pleasant. So both Flavian and Eusebius are declared heretics. The letter from Leo is never read, because it doesn't want to be. And Dioscorus wraps up everything in Ephesus in a day. Very efficient government. This really makes Leo mad in the West. He gets kind of fired up. They appeal to Theodosius II, but Theodosius, remember, had all kinds of gold coming between him and Alexandria, so he wasn't really inclined to change anything. But then he dies in a horse riding accident. And the next person that come up is Pulcheria. Pulcheria marries a guy named Marcion. Now, Pulcheria was a very faithful Christian, at least as far as we can tell. In fact, she was so faithful, she took a vow of celibacy before she married Marcion. Then she marries Marcion because she was a sister of Theodosius, and she needed an emperor because she was just the queen. And so she marries this guy Marcion, but they never actually consummate their marriage, so they never actually had any children. Marcion had a child from an earlier marriage, whatever. But they never actually consummate the marriage, which I thought was kind of weird. Anyways, these two realized that what happened in Ephesus was a farce, and so they call another council. This time, though, instead of asking either an Antiochian or an Alexandrian, they actually ask the Pope in the West, in Rome, to come and preside over it as a neutral party. He can't make it because they're about to get attacked by Attila the Hun. So he sends a representative. The representatives get a chance to read Leo's letter. Leo's letter says, no, it's two natures, one person, just like we've always believed. Let's leave it at that. People in attendance, which was actually the biggest council ever, in Chalcedon, agree that that's what we all believe. Leave it at that. Leo's right. Leo speaks for all of us. Do you see what's happening to Leo? Let me pump up your ego a little bit more. Leo's the guy. He's got it right. Let's do it. So they allow Leo's letter to be the guiding principle. Dioscorus is never allowed to speak. No, I take that back. He was allowed to speak. He declines to speak. He was not given a vote, which he didn't deserve to. But let's see. So Leo reads his letter. That's what everybody agrees to. Dioscorus is condemned. Eusebius and Flavian, for Flavian, was posthumously declared not a heretic, and he was given a Christian burial. And this group, the Council of Chalcedon, decide we don't want another creed, but we should issue a definition or a new confession that reaffirms what we all believe. And so they came up with the following. You can see it on page 9 of your notes. I formatted it to make it a little bit easier to see the different points. We then, following the Holy Fathers, all with one consent, teach people to confess one and the same Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, the same perfect in Godhead and also perfect in manhood. Remember the issue at play. Truly God and truly man, of a reasonable, meaning rational, thinking, soul and body, consubstantial with the Father according to the Godhead, and consubstantial with us according to the manhood. Remember all these things. He's 100% us and he's 100% God. He's both. In all things like unto us without sin, begotten before all ages of the Father according to the Godhead, and in these latter days for us in our salvation, born of the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, according to the manhood, not Mother of Christ, Mother of God, one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, to be acknowledged in two natures, inconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, and inseparably. So those four terms are important. In other words, inconfusedly means they don't mix. He's 100% God and 100% man. He's not something different. He's not some hybrid. He's both. Unchangeably, they don't change. They're always there. They're indivisible. They're unified. And they're inseparable. So he's one and the same. Two natures, one person. Okay? The distinction of natures being by no means taken away by the union, but rather the property of each nature being preserved and concurring in one person and one subsistence, the hypostasis, not parted or divided into two persons, but one and the same Son, the only begotten God, the Word, the Lord Jesus Christ, as the prophets from the beginning have declared concerning him, and the Lord Jesus Christ himself has taught us, and the creed of the Holy Fathers is handed down to us. Now, if you notice, there's no explanation of how it works. There's just a statement of, here's what it is, and this is where we're going. That was the Council of Chalcedon. Mm-hmm.
Who are the Holy Fathers there?
Previous popes. Yeah. If you notice, how much scripture have we talked about so far? Do you see a worrying trend that's happening in the church? We're debating more and more about what the Holy Father said. Well, Cyril said this. We should evaluate his writing based on what Cyril wrote. We should evaluate his purpose by what Leo wrote. And so what happens is they start to assume, actually part of this, after this confession, this council also recognizes the letter of Leo to be authoritative. And they recognized selected writings from Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria, to be authoritative. Well, that seems fair. I mean, they were pretty good writings, right? What's the problem with that? They're not reading the Bible. Why don't we, as a Protestant church, have the same issue? Why don't we care what Leo thought? Because we don't accept him as authoritative. Is he got good information? Yep. Did Cyril have good information? Absolutely. And we'll read them. But we're not going to evaluate our theology by what Cyril thought. That was the Reformation. It's no longer about the church fathers and their authority. It's about the scriptures and their authority, and the church fathers are under judgment by the scriptures, not vice versa.
That's one of the dangers that we fall into. The pastor said, my favorite
Yep.
preacher, whatever said, we tend to fall into that same kind of thing.
Yeah,
if
too
we're not
often.
careful.
Too often we quote, well, I heard MacArthur say. Well, John Piper was about this. He preached on this. Yeah, that's good. And those men are faithful men with great learning, and they have good hearts, but all of their teaching has to be evaluated by the scriptures. The Bereans took what they heard and they evaluated by the scriptures. We need to take Leo's words and Cyril's words, and we evaluate them by the scriptures. And if there's gold, use it. That's good stuff. But what was happening here was now we're starting to take the church fathers and what they wrote, and that's what's authoritative. Authoritative meaning, if you violate these things, I can hold you accountable. It doesn't matter how much your argument is true. If you violate these things, I hold you accountable. And who decides what's authoritative? Well, the Pope. And if the Pope holds what's authoritative and you violate what the Pope says, but the Pope could make mistakes. Well, that's not anymore. The Pope's infallible. Right? Except for this one Pope who we'll talk about in a few minutes. Let's see. In terms of practicality, the Council of Chalcedon also had a number of other things that are really interesting. I read the rest of the canons on this one. They condemned Dioscorus, we already talked about. And then, so if he was condemned, what happens? Well, Marcion, the emperor, decides to banish him. Why is that an issue? What just happened? The church declares him a heretic, and the state intervenes. They placed monasteries under the rule of the local bishop, and they forbade the ordination of monks to the bishopric. Where do you think that's coming from? What does that subtly tell you is happening? The monks are becoming more and more powerful. They're becoming more and more important. So the church has to feel like they have to put them under their rule, otherwise the monks are going to go crazy and become a competing institution, which is exactly what happened. They forbade a single bishop from having multiple cities. That also happened with John Chrysostom. They reinforced the authority of the church over all members, including traveling clergymen. And monks were not allowed to have local assemblies without the approval of the local bishop. The term was actually conventicles. We've been going through Pilgrim's Progress, and that's exactly what John Bunyan was arrested for in the 1500s, was having an unauthorized conventicle. This was 451. John Bunyan was arrested in the 1500s for the same issue. A deaconess must be 40 years old to be ordained, and she must never marry, or she risks excommunication. Monks and nuns can never marry, or they risk excommunication. Those condemned by the church in one city cannot be declared innocent in another. Otherwise, the condemned individual, as well as the bishop who declared him innocent, will be excommunicated. You're not allowed to elope. Oh, that was funny. If a layman elopes, he is an anathema. If a clergyman elopes, he is expelled from the church. And anyone that helps the eloping couple will also be excommunicated. I don't know. I'm guessing, I didn't look into this one. I'm guessing that this is kind of starting to go towards the fact that marriage is becoming a sacrament. And so if you elope, you're doing so outside of the church. You're doing it without the blessing of the church. The clergyman eloping is an issue because now they're starting to move towards celibacy. Well, the West is. The East, not so much. All right, and then there's this little pronouncement: the bishop of New Rome shall enjoy the same honor as the bishop of Old Rome. What does that change? What is that saying? The bishop of New Rome, that's Constantinople, is now what? Equal to the bishop of Rome. So Leo said, I love your council, except I have an issue with that one. But he has a choice. Either he says he takes his council, which loved his writings and want to venerate him because he is such a great guy, or he can reject the whole thing and say, I don't accept this. He decides, all right, we're going to protest that one point, but go ahead. Because why? Well, because we were appointed by the Apostle Peter. Remember apostolic succession? We were in Rome appointed by the Apostle Peter. Is that true? Absolutely not. Is it true to them? Absolutely. It's not what it was for. The apostolic succession, that whole idea, was so that people didn't add to the Bible. They wanted some kind of authority that says, no, we have the Bible because we know who we got it from. Now it's being used to say, I'm the most important bishop to declare what's authoritative, and nobody else is. You all have to listen to me. And so when they said the bishop of Constantinople is equal to you, Rome had a fit. Of course, why was the bishop of Constantinople equal to the bishop of Rome? Because it was a major populated city. Duh. That's all you need. It's just as flimsy. The whole thing is a farce. Like I said, this is the depressing part of church history. Things are not going well in the church at this point. But they're starting to realize a couple things, and they start to come up with the Council of Chalcedon and their confession, which is faithful. It's good stuff. All right, that's the debate over Christology. The churches that don't agree with the Council of Chalcedon move east. They're generally called the monophysite, one-person churches, although it's unfair because many of them agree with the dual natures. They just want more emphasis on the unity. A lot of these churches actually still exist. They're called the Oriental Orthodox Church, and they call themselves Maya-physicists, meaning one unified, I forget how it turns. Basically, they don't disagree with the dual natures. They just place an emphasis on the unity. They reject it. They reject the Council of Chalcedon and its confession in the way that it's written. A number of Christians outside of Rome also outside of the Byzantine Empire, reject the Council of Chalcedon because it was written by the Byzantine Empire. And they just don't like that, so they just reject it. By the 8th century, this debate continues on. The 8th century, 700s. It goes on for 300 years. Finally, there's a big debate on the use of Christian art. Is that allowed? After all, what is the second commandment? Thou shalt have no graven images. Well, what was Jesus? 100% God, right? So you can't have a graven image of God. So then they came back and said, well, yeah, but he's also 100% human. So we can have graven images of a human. So eventually the debate is finally given. But guess what that does? It torques the church in the West, who never had an issue with Christian art. It was another exclusively Eastern issue. Which brings us to what we call the Filioque. Okay? All right, so the creed that came out of Constantinople in 381, not the one we just read, the Creed of Constantinople goes to say, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and of all things visible and invisible. It should sound fairly familiar to those who like Rich Mullins songs. That's where he got it. And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all worlds, light of lights, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, and for us men, so on. And then there's this little passage here, the next to last paragraph. And in the Holy Ghost, the Lord and giver of life, who proceedeth from the Father, who with the Father and the Son together is worshipped and glorified, and who spake by the prophets. Now, what does it say? Who proceedeth from the Father. Okay? Proceeding comes from the Latin word proceduro. This original quote was actually written in 381. What language was it written in? Greek. Okay? The word for proceed in Greek was actually the idea of sourced. Where does he originate from? Where is he sent from? That's where the question was. And the Bible is very clear that it's the Father who sends the Spirit into the world. Okay? So in that term, that makes sense. This is absolutely correct. And in the Holy Ghost, the Lord and giver of life, who proceedeth from the Father, who originates from the Father, who is sent by the Father. Okay? When it was translated into Latin, which is where we get our stuff, it's translated with the word proceduro, which just means sending. It was sent by. It didn't matter who it's sent by or how it was sent or where it originated. It was just sent by something else. So if I tell my son to go send a letter, I write the letter and I say, hey, Aiden, go put this in the mailbox. You could say, Aiden sent it, and I sent it. Because technically, we both kind of sent the letter. We all both had a place in sending the letter. It didn't originate with Aiden, but he had a role in sending it. Does that make sense? So the Latin word for procedure, proceed from, is just an agency, not a source. Okay? Stick with me. This is going to make sense in a second. Biblically, what we see is the Son does send the Spirit through the Father. Okay? So it would be accurate to say that the Spirit was sent by the Father through the Son. That's a totally fair statement, and that's biblical. Going through John 15, John 16, places where the Holy Spirit is referred to as the Spirit of Christ in Galatians and other places, they're tied together. The Spirit is sent by the Father, but he's sent by the Son. The Son asks the Father to send him. The Son has agency to send the Spirit. Okay? We could go into theology, but just take it. Trust me. You're allowed to say that the Son sent the Spirit, if you use the correct term. But what's written in the Creed? That the Spirit proceeds from the Father, right? It was a poor translation word because there's nothing in Latin that captures the same Greek term. So what did the West start to do? Well, they added a term called the Filioque that says the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. So they're just trying to change the creed. Okay? So in the Holy Ghost, the giver of life, who proceedeth from the Father and the Son. Okay, so they started using this more often. Is it wrong? No, it's totally correct, especially using the word in Latin. But what was the issue? Well, they changed the creed. And who came up with the creed? Well, the entire church. So what was happening in the West? They were changing the creed. They were changing the thing that everybody agreed to, which brings up what? Authority. Who are you to add to or remove the creed? And if you look at the councils of Nicaea, Constantinople, and Chalcedon, there were condemnations against changing the creeds that these councils had come up with. So what was happening in the West? They were changing the creeds. Were they wrong? No, but that's not the issue. It never is the issue. Eastern opposition came as early as the 7th century in the 600s during a verbal battle between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope of Rome. You've probably heard this before. The Pope was accused of using the Filioque without authorization of the entire church. They kind of keep going back and forth. The real challenge came in the 8th and 9th centuries when the Frankish kingdom became a dominant power in the West. So the French causing more problems. Just kidding. Only kidding. Gotta take that out of that. So the Franks start to take over, and they become a dominant power of Europe. And they actually take over Gaul. They take over most of Western Europe and unify them. You'll know the guy, Charlemagne, is a Frankish king. Okay? Somehow the Frankish church comes to the conclusion that the Filioque and the Son was actually part of the original creed. And they start teaching it, and they start including it in their liturgy, and they start including it, chanting it during their church services and when they're celebrating Mass. Right? So the Filioque becomes the new norm in the West. Okay? As their numbers grew, they also grew in arrogance. So now they started insisting that the Filioque passage was actually part of the original. And then actually come to the Bishop of Rome and say, see, it's in the original. And the Bishop of Rome would say, actually, it's not. It never was. And they would say, you're wrong. It was in the original. The Franks don't go back that far. So how they knew that, anybody's guess. But they were very insistent that this was part of the original creed. And so what do you start doing when you're convinced of a dogmatic truth that you have no basis for? Insisting that everybody else agrees with you. And so as they started interacting with the churches of the East, guess what they started insisting upon? Include this in your liturgy. You have to say this. This is right. If you don't say this, you're wrong. Well, the East never really used the Filioque, so what happens? They start having issues. And then Charlemagne, he wants to kind of go to war with the Byzantine Empire, and so he starts looking for reasons to go to war. And so he keeps appealing to the Rome to say, just say it's in the original, so I can accuse them of heresy and we can go to battle. And the Pope actually refused. He actually put it on silver plates. Here's the creed, the original creed, and he actually was unwilling to agree with them. But the Franks were on a warpath, and they kept trying. Here's what also comes, and this all comes around. In Spain, the idea of adoptionism, this is all after Islam is actually pushed into Spain, and they're pushed back out by Charles Martel. Adoptionism starts to come back into play in Spain. And guess how the church, especially the Franks, fought against adoptionism? We pull out the creed, and we start insisting that this is Orthodox Christianity, not adoptionism. So now, if the Pope comes in and says, no, that creed is incorrect, what is he also doing? He's undercutting the fight against the adoptionists. So now he's in a tough spot. He tried. They didn't know what to do. They didn't disagree. They tried to keep it up. Mid to late 800s. Eventually, though, let's see. Michael III usurped the throne in Constantinople. That led to a guy named Photius. A lot of politics involved. Michael III usurps the throne. He gets rid of Ignatius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, brings in Photius. Photius wants support, but the Pope, by this point, who believes he's important in all matters ecclesiastical, decides that he wants to weigh in and say, no, Photius is incorrect, Ignatius is the right guy. Well, Photius gets torqued and says, I hate you. And your little Filioque passage tells me that you're a heretic anyways, and I don't want to listen to you. That's how you get rid of the opposing voice, is to call them a heretic. We've already been through this a few times now. The Pope of Rome, however, says, oh yeah? Well, you're a heretic, and you are now excommunicated. So they go back and forth. But the Filioque was the reason. And Photius goes on to say, oh yeah, well, you guys want to say and the Son? Well, I'm going to say the Father alone. And so now the East starts to say the Spirit proceeds from the Father alone, which actually isn't entirely inaccurate. But now what is Photius doing to the creed? He's changing it, right? So now you got two opposing groups, each one doing what the other one considers wrong, and they hate each other, all because of this little addition that's not even unbiblical. Nobody's sitting down to say, what's biblical? What's scriptural? Is this correct? Is it wrong to say the Father alone? No. Now if you're talking about original procession and source, is it wrong to say and the Son? No. Now if you're talking about agency, which one are we talking about? Or could it be both? Maybe we ought to clarify the creed a little bit and add a couple of sentences to it that makes this whole thing go away. We can't do that. We've got to insist that what the Fathers say is correct. The Fathers say this, therefore it has to be correct. We cannot adjust what's authoritative. See the issues that we're getting into? So, this little Filioque passage becomes kind of a rallying cry for the East to complain about the Pope's authority. And the Pope demands that the East accept it. Why? Because he's the authority. He's the one that rules over all the churches, and if he says it's okay, it's okay. And guess what happened in 1014? The Pope finally gave in and said, that is the creed. The creed should include and the Son. It should include the Filioque. And if he said it, therefore all churches should adopt it, and therefore they require that the Eastern Church adopt the Filioque passage. They refused, just in case you were wondering. So there's a number of issues. The restriction of Christian art. Antioch is gone. Jerusalem's gone. Filioque. 1053 comes around. And now there's a new group invading Europe. It's called the Normans. I think it's the same as the Vikings, right? Yeah. The Normans now invading. Well, they're invading Italy, and they're also a threat to the Byzantine Empire. So we need to fight back. Maybe we ought to unify. So guess who's the leader of Italy? The Pope. He's now a political leader by this point in history. He reaches out to the emperor of the Byzantine Empire and says, how about if we ally together? The emperor says, that's a great idea. The Pope says, that's a great idea. You send your people, I'll send my people. Let's meet in Constantinople, we'll make this thing official. Okay. So they send letters. By this point, the church in the West is demanding clerical celibacy, and they're also deciding that they want to observe communion using unleavened bread. Heresy, right? But they were insisting that that is correct. And the guy that takes the letter of allegiance is a guy named Humbert. Humbert wholeheartedly believed in clerical celibacy and the use of unleavened bread. And now he's going to go to a people with a language he doesn't speak, a people he doesn't care about, a people who don't agree with him on unleavened bread, and a people that don't agree with him on celibacy. What could possibly go wrong? This is like saying, hey, Donald Trump, can you be our ambassador to Mexico? We would love for you to be our ambassador to Mexico, given all the current events. So for whatever reason, Pope, I forget which Pope it is, decides to send Cardinal Humbert. Humbert comes into the Patriarch and says, hey, by the way, you guys are flawed, and you're totally messed up in your thinking. Patriarch doesn't take that as a compliment. He exchanges insults. Humbert walks out. The next day, they're celebrating communion in the Hagia Sophia, which is the main church in Constantinople. And Humbert decides to come in, throw down a papal bull, which is an order from the Pope, that excommunicates the Patriarch. In front of the church, on the day of communion, he goes straight into the main church, up to the altar, throws down a piece of paper. It's like dropping the microphone, and then he walks out. So a few days later, Michael excommunicates Humbert, and now everything's from there. The die is cast. Okay, so Humbert returns, tells him they excommunicated you, just FYI, and so now the Patriarch refuses to accept anything from the Pope. The Pope is now excommunicated unofficially because the Pope had actually died. So where this papal bull came from is totally invalid. Humbert made it up. It has no power. And then Michael's excommunication, if you actually read it, is only against Humbert, not against the entire Western Church. But what happened is, the interpretation is, and at the time they didn't think it was a big deal, but from that point forward, the West says, well, we excommunicated you because you're a joke. And the East says, well, we excommunicated you because you guys added to the creed. And that becomes a dominant theme in the East-West relations through the 20th century. They still have not reconciled. They still won't accept the fact that you believe this and you believe that. I can't accept that. The Pope cannot get along with the Patriarch. They refuse to unify. As Protestants, we don't really care that much, right? It's not really us, but it is the unity of the church. There are believers in the Orthodox Church. And so this is a matter of unity. So it doesn't matter to us in that regard. It doesn't really matter in the church politics. Okay? But from that point forward, that's the schism. At this point, we're going to follow the Western tradition. Stuff happens in the East. I'm not denying that. But from this point forward, we're generally going to follow what happens in the West, because that's more directly related to us as Protestants and United States Christians. Make sense? Like I said, lots of information. You can read through this. There's more details, but that's a lot. That's a lot. A lot of people, a lot of positions, some biblical, some not, and that's really where we're going to struggle for the next few weeks, is seeing the biblical part of the passage not being reflected in the popular speaking and the positions that are taken. And that's what we have to understand. Because when God brings Martin Luther to the fore and Martin Luther points at his Bible and says, this is what matters, you're going to love it because it's finally going to start making sense.